NASCAR returns full throttle in just over 48 hours after hitting the brakes for more than 2 months during the pandemic.
Our first priority is to make sure that we put on the safest event.
Can he clear him?
But the roaring engines will fill an empty stadium with no fans allowed at the raceway.
Crash into the wall, into the air.
Sunday also marks the first time Ryan Newman will be back behind the wheel since this horrific crash at the Daytona 500. We spoke about his return in an interview set to air Saturday on Weekend Nightly News.
You survived a near-death experience. Was there any hesitation at all about coming back?
None at all. I mean, not even a second, really, not even a second, because it's a combination of my love and desire for our sport.
From the track,
187 yards,
to the greens. The PGA has a charity tournament this weekend in Florida. The full tour is getting ready to tee off in June in Fort Worth, Texas. Safety precautions include testing players and no handshakes on the course. Overnight on CNN, Major League Baseball's commissioner facing questions about testing.
What are the kind of the parameters you're thinking about?
We have developed extensive protocols. A key to those is frequent testing. All of our players would be tested multiple times a week.
Commissioner Rob Manfred remaining bullish on baseball by midsummer, although a deal with the Players Union could prove elusive.
No, I got to get my money. I'm not playing unless I get mine, okay?
All-star pitcher Blake Snell of the Tampa Bay Rays already saying he won't play for a reduced salary over a shortened season, one of the options the league is considering.
I'm sorry if you guys think differently, but the risk is way the hell higher and the amount of money I make is way lower. Why would I think about doing that?
The NBA has not made a decision on a return to play or what form that would take as practice facilities reopen with tight restrictions. And the NFL's schedule still shows a September 8th start date, though details on testing remain sparse. Florida's governor recently rolling out the welcome mat.
All professional sports are welcome here for practicing and for playing. Now, we're not going to necessarily have fans.
That will be the case when NASCAR returns to Florida, with 12 new races added through June, none with spectators.
I think it's a great opportunity for us to be able to go out there and be one of the first major sports to be back on television, to be back doing what we all love to do.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.